The horses his whole season depended on came home behind a woman he'd never met. The gate chain was still warm when I got there. Whoever had dropped it hadn't been gone more than a few minutes. I stood in the yard with my lantern and looked at my horses in the corral, 8 of them, every one accounted for, still breathing hard from the push, flanks dark with dried sweat that had gone almost to salt in the cold air. The bay with the white sock on his left hind. The Grulla mare I'd been nursing since March. All 8. I counted them twice, because I'm a man who counts things twice. Then I counted the hoofprints in the soft dirt outside the gate. 9 sets going in, 8 horses. 1 horse had left going out, headed south. I lifted the lantern and looked south into the dark, and the dark didn't give anything back. I stood there a long minute. The horses were blowing and shifting, settling. The Grulla came to the fence and put her nose through the rail and breathed on my hand, and I let her, and I thought about those hoofprints. I went inside and I didn't sleep. That's where this starts, if you need a starting place. Though I've thought about it long enough to know it started before that, maybe the drought in July that turned the south pasture to chalk, or my foreman Gil leaving in August to take his family back to San Antonio, or the raid that took those 8 horses in the first place. Or maybe it started the year I turned 53 and realized I had built something here on the Canyon Rojo, something that actually stood, that had walls and grass and water and reputation, and that I had built it completely alone, and that I intended to keep it that way, and that those 2 things were maybe not as comfortable together as I'd always told myself. But the hoofprints, that's where you'd mark it on a map if you were marking a map. My name is Amos Crail. I came to the Canyon Rojo country in 1871 with $40, a sharps that had seen the war, and a conviction, not a plan, a conviction that I was going to make something here that would outlast me. I did not have a partner. I did not have backing. I had worked 3 years on other men's ranches and watched how they made their mistakes, and I intended to make different ones. The Rojo is not easy country. The canyon country along the Pecos Breaks is not the soft ranch country you hear about in some places. It is hard rock and cedar and grama grass that comes in thin and goes brown fast and makes you earn every pound of beef you put on a steer. The summers scorch and the winters crack, and in between there are the men who come through looking to take from somebody who's built. I had been taken from. I had chased men off this land with a rifle. I had buried 2 of my own horses that were too far gone to save after a bad winter in '78, and I stood in that cold and looked at what the ground was taking back, and I promised myself it would not take any more. Not from me. I built the main house out of local stone in 1876. I hired hands as I could afford them and let them go when I couldn't. By the time I turned 50, I was running around 400 head of cattle and 40 horses, which for this country was not a small operation. I had a reputation as a straight dealer and a hard man to cross, and both of those were correct. The horses were the pride of it. Quarter horses mostly, bred for cow work, with some blood I'd brought in from a stallion in New Mexico that had given the line an extra something, a quickness in the hindquarters and a calm that held under pressure. I sold them to ranchers and to the cavalry and to men who knew horseflesh, and the money from the horses is what let me carry the cattle operation through the years the market went soft. Those 8 horses were the nucleus of the next breeding season. 3 of them were mares I was counting on to drop foals by late spring. The other 5 were 2-year-olds I had contracts to deliver. When they took them, 3 men, night riders, one of them good enough on a horse to cut the lock from the outside without making the others nervous, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not panic, not quite grief, something older. The feeling of a man who has built a thing carefully and correctly and finds out that the building of it doesn't protect it. I went after them the next morning with my best hand, a boy named Doyle who was 24 and serious, and we tracked them 2 days east into the Breaks country, and then the rain came and washed the tracks, and we came home with nothing. I reported it to the sheriff in Turling, who wrote it down in a ledger and told me he'd keep his ears open. I thanked him in a way that did not fully convey my confidence in that plan. That was mid-September. The contracts on the 2-year-olds were due to be fulfilled by the 1st of November. The breeding window on the mares would close by February. I sat on the porch of the stone house on a September evening and watched the last of the light leave the canyon rim and did the arithmetic that I already knew the answer to, and the answer was not good. And then in late October, 6 weeks after, the gate chain was warm and there were 9 sets of hoofprints going in and 1 horse going out. I found out in the morning who it was. She came riding back to the gate at first light on a brown horse I didn't recognize, not one of mine, and she sat it easy, the way a person sits a horse they know well, and she looked at my gate and then looked up and found me standing on the porch with coffee I hadn't drunk yet, and she didn't say anything for a second, like she was calculating something. She was maybe 35, dark-haired, the hair pinned but loosening in the way of someone who'd been riding through the night. A good coat, canvas, worn but well cared for. She had the kind of face that had been a long time in sun and wind and had come to an arrangement with that. Not soft, not hard. Settled. "Mr. Crail," she said. "That's right," I said. "Your horses are in your corral." "They are," I said. "Come up and have some coffee." She tied the brown horse at the rail and came up the porch steps, and I held the door. She walked into the stone house and looked at it the way people sometimes do, not rudely, just a noticing, taking in the shelves and the fireplace and the table with the lamp still burning from last night. Some people walk into a house and it tells them something about the person who built it. She was one of those people. I poured coffee and set it in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were calloused across the base of the fingers, the way a writer's are. A long scratch on the back of the right hand, dried. "My name is Nora Vess," she said. "I have a small horse operation about 12 miles south of here, down off the Llano. My father ran it before me. He died in the spring." "I'm sorry," I said. "Thank you," she said it straight, not playing for sympathy. "I knew your horses because I've seen your brand before. Came across them being held in a box canyon about 20 miles south of here in the breaks. 3 men with them. I watched from the ridge a couple of days, waiting for something. On the 3rd day 2 of the men left and only 1 stayed." She picked up her coffee. She didn't add anything to that statement. She just let it sit there while she drank. I said, "1 man." "Yes." "And then the horses came home." "Yes." I looked at the scratch on the back of her hand. I looked at it, and then I looked at her face, and she met that without changing anything. "What happened to the man?" I said. "He left," she said, "on a horse that wasn't one of yours." That was all she would say about that. I didn't push it. A woman running an operation alone in that country, watching a box canyon for 3 days, deciding when to move. I had a fair idea of what kind of conversation the man had been given and how she'd been persuasive enough to conclude it, and I figured however she'd done it she'd had good reason. "You drove them 12 miles in the dark," I said. "I know the country." "Your horse went home." "She knows the way." I sat back and looked at this woman sitting at my table with her hands around a coffee cup, matter of fact as if she'd returned a stray dog. "Miss Vess," I said, "I don't know what to say to you." She looked at me directly, green eyes steady. "You don't need to say anything. I knew whose horses they were. I brought them back." "That is not a thing most people would do," I said, "or could." "No," she said, and that was all, not modest, not proud, just accurate. I refilled her cup. Outside, the light was coming up over the canyon rim, and I could hear my horses in the corral, and the feeling I'd had sitting on the porch the night before, the arithmetic, the damage, was still there, but it was sitting differently. It had company. She went home that morning, rode south on the brown horse, which had come back on its own at some point during the night, apparently knowing she'd need it. I watched her go from the gate and then went in to start what needed to be done with the horses, checking them over. The grulla's feet, The bay's back where the saddle sores from the ride had started to work, and I worked through the morning and I thought about Nora Vess. I found out more about her in the next few days, the way you find things out in range country, which is to say without asking directly. She was the daughter of a man named Curtis Vess who had run horses on the Llano tableland for about 15 years, a decent small operation, not mine, but solid. He had died in March. A horse had put him down, kicked him in the chest, and he'd lasted 3 days. Nora had been running the place since with one hired hand, a Mexican man named Reyes who'd been there since before Curtis died. She had no brothers. There had been a husband once, the story went, a man who had not stayed. The story of the husband I heard in pieces and never from her. What I was able to assemble was this: a man from the Panhandle country, a couple of years her senior, not a horseman but a cattle man who'd had some early luck and then less of it. They'd been married 3 or 4 years and he'd wanted to go back to the Panhandle, and she'd wanted to stay on the Llano and run her father's horses. And eventually, the wanting had settled things between them in the only way wanting can when neither person bends. She had bent about as far as she was going to bend, was my understanding, and he had gone to the Panhandle. I did not fault her for it. A woman who will go into the breaks country alone to recover 8 horses is not a woman who was going to unmake herself for someone who had himself already run out of luck. Some choices make themselves, if you have the honesty to see them. She was known in Turling as a fair dealer and a woman who didn't waste words. The livery man said she knew more about horses than most men he'd met. The sheriff, who I'd told about the recovery, said, "Nora Vess," and nodded slowly, like that explained something without needing explanation. I rode south 3 days after she'd been at my table, not with a plan. I told myself I was checking the brakes for sign of the 2 men who'd gotten away, which was partly true. But I rode south and I came off the Llano rim on a November morning, cold and bright, and I found the Vess place. It was small. Barn and corral and a low adobe house with a good stone foundation. Someone had put that in carefully. The corral had 8 horses in it, good ones. You could see it even from a distance, the way they stood. A woman does not inherit horses that stand like that unless she knows what she's doing. Reyes came out of the barn and looked at me. "Mr. Crail," I said. He nodded. "Miss Vess is in the barn." She came out a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a cloth, and saw me, and her face did the same thing it had done at my gate, a quick internal calculation, and then settled. "Mr. Crail," she said. "I came to offer something," I said. "I had thought about this on the ride. What you did for me, recovering those horses, I owe you a debt I'm not sure I can square, but I can try. I'm going to need someone with horse knowledge for the winter through the breeding season. Good wage. If you want to bring Reyes, I have room. Your own horses could come up for the winter, better grass." She looked at me. She didn't say anything right away. "I'm not asking you to give up your place," I said. "This would be a working arrangement. You'd go back to the Llano in the spring." "Why me?" she said. It was a fair question. "Because you spent 3 days on a canyon rim for horses that weren't yours," I said. "That tells me what I need to know about how you work." She thought about it. She looked at the corral and then at Reyes and then at the ground for a second, and then she looked at me. "All right," she said. She came up to the Rojo the following Monday, Reyes with her, 8 horses trailing behind. I had the bunkhouse aired out, and a room off the main barn cleared for Reyes, and I'd had Doyle build up the fence on the west pasture where the Vess horses would run through the winter. The Vess horses were good. 8 of them mixed 3 mares, 2 geldings of working age, 2 young ones, and a compact buckskin stallion that walked into my yard like he owned it, and then changed his mind when he saw my stallion looking at him through the paddock rails. Smart animal. He recalculated. I respected that. Nora watched me look at them. I could feel her watching. "The buckskin threw both those young ones," she said. I can see that in the shoulder, I said. The angle of bone there, the width of the chest. What about the chest on the black gelding? He been run hard recently. He was my father's horse, she said. Curtis never bobbied him. I nodded. The horse had good legs underneath all that and an honest eye. He'd come back. They're yours, she said, meaning. Your professional opinion is welcome, not requested. And I understood that. These were her horses the way the Rojo was my place, which meant the opinion came at a certain cost in pride even when it was sought. Good stock, I said, and I meant it, which is the only kind of compliment worth giving. The first morning I showed her the operation, the breeding records, which I kept in a ledger with a system that made sense to me and perhaps only to me, the lineage charts, which mares were due, which stallion I was planning to use and when. She listened without interrupting and asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. The third one I had to think about before answering, which I did not often have to do. You keep it all in the ledger, she said after I'd answered. What happens if the ledger burns? It hasn't burned, I said. No, she said, but if it did. I looked at her, then I'd rebuild it from what I know. You know all of this from memory. I built it, I said. I remember what I build. She nodded slow, not impressed in a soft way, something more like recognition. A person who does that themselves knowing it when they see it in someone else. We worked well from the first day, which surprised me. I am not an easy man to work beside. I have opinions about how things are done, and they are not soft opinions, and I had run this place alone long enough that having another person make a decision, even a good one, required a moment of adjustment. She was the same way, I discovered. She had her views, and they were not soft either. The first real disagreement was about the Grulla mare, whether she was ready to be put with the stallion or whether she needed another 2 weeks. Nora said 2 weeks. I said ready now. We stood on either side of the fence looking at the Grulla, and we were quiet for a bit. Look at how she carries her left hip, Nora said. I looked. She's compensating for something, Nora said. She's been doing it since she came back from wherever those men had her. You see it. I looked for another moment, and I did see it. A slight unevenness, a tiny rotation in the haunch when she moved. Nothing dramatic. The kind of thing you miss if you're looking at the horse instead of watching her. 2 weeks, I said. Nora didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That was the pattern. She was right often enough that I stopped being surprised by it, and the surprise had been a kind of insult in the first place. I had been surprised because she was a woman, and that was my error, and I got over it. What she had was what I had, which was 20-some years of living close to horses and paying attention. Her 20-some years had a different shape than mine, smaller scale, different country, but the attention was the same quality. You can't fake that kind of attention. A horse knows it inside 5 minutes. Ray's was good, quiet, careful with the stock. He and Doyle found a way to work together without much talking, which is the best kind of arrangement. The place ran better than it had since Gil left for San Antonio. November went into December, and the nights went hard, and I built the fires up, and the work continued. There is a thing that happens when you live alone a long time. You stop accounting for yourself to anyone. Not in a lawless way, I don't mean that. I mean you stop explaining your reasons. You make a decision and it stands or falls on its own without the step of having said it out loud first. I had forgotten that the step of saying it out loud had a value. Not because you need permission. Because saying a thing out loud shapes it. Sometimes you hear something in the saying that you would have missed in the thinking. I had also stopped, somewhere in the long years of it, noticing what things felt like. Not what they produced or cost or required. What they felt like. There is a difference between a man who manages his life and a man who lives it, and somewhere in the middle years I had crossed from one side of that to the other without marking it. You don't mark it when it happens. You are too busy. The fence needs riding, and the books need keeping, and the contracts need filing, and there is always a horse that needs something. And then you look up one day and you are 53, and the canyon is quiet, and the supper is cold because you made it yourself and ate it while reading a breeding record. And the house has been that quiet for so long that you have stopped hearing it as quiet and started just hearing it as the house. I am not saying this to complain. I am saying it because it is the context without which what comes next does not make full sense. Nora was not a woman who asked me to explain myself, but she was present, and her presence had a weight that made me speak more than I had in years. Over supper in the barn out along the fence line. Not idle talk. Real talk about the breeding program, about the range conditions, about what I knew of the men who'd taken the horses and whether they'd come back, about what she intended to do with the Vess place, whether she'd keep it or sell, about her father. She talked about Curtis Vess directly, without the kind of careful handling people sometimes use around the dead. He had been a difficult man, she said. Not cruel, but difficult. He had not believed, until late, that what she knew about horses was worth as much as what a man half her age might know just by virtue of being a man. She had spent years proving it to him by degrees, and then he had died before she felt completely satisfied that she had. "Do you think he knew?" I said. We were at the supper table a December night, cold outside, the fire going. She was quiet a moment. "I think he knew more than he showed," she said. "Men like that, men who built something and are proud of it, they sometimes can't afford to admit that someone else sees it clearly. Because if you see it clearly, maybe you could run it. And if you could run it, then what is he?" I sat with that. "He left you the place," I said. "Yes," she said. "He left me the place." And the way she said it held both things at once, the gift and the argument it had never quite finished making. I poured more coffee and didn't say anything for a while. The fire settled. The wind outside was working along the stone walls, looking for a way in. "I understand something about that," I said finally, "the not being able to say the thing directly." She looked at me. "It's not a good quality," I said, "in a man." "No," she said, "but it's a common one." She said it without judgment, just the plain fact, which was, in its way, a kindness, the kind that doesn't fuss over you. There was something I had not said to Nora, and I want to say it here, because it matters to what came next. The two men who had gotten away, the ones who had taken my horses and left one man behind in that box canyon, I had not stopped thinking about them. I had reported them to the sheriff, who had written them down, and I had told the story around Turling, which is how you build a kind of informal intelligence in range country, people knowing to bring you word. But I had not stopped thinking about them in the particular way a man thinks about something that is unfinished. They had my horses for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks you learn a brand and a layout and you ride a range enough to know it. If they wanted the horses back or wanted something else, the question was when, not whether. I told Nora about this the second week she was at the Rojo. I told her directly, which is the only way I know to tell something important. We were at the supper table and I said, "The two men who had the horses know this place. I want you to be aware of that." She looked at me and said, "What are you planning to do about it?" "Wait," I said, "and be ready." "What does ready look like?" "Doyle has a rifle and he knows how to use it," I said. "Raised too, I expect." I looked at her. "And I imagine you didn't spend 3 days on a canyon rim with nothing to defend yourself with." She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face acknowledged that this was a fair statement. "All right," she said. "What do you want me to do if they come?" "Stay out of the line of it," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I've heard that before," she said. "It's never quite how it goes." "No," I said, "it usually isn't." They came on a Tuesday night in late November, which I mention because Tuesday nights in late November are when you're not expecting it. There is a kind of calculation that goes into when to come, not too soon after the horses were recovered, enough time for attention to drift, but before winter makes the approaches difficult. Tuesday and not Friday, because Friday is when men who are going to make trouble come, and anyone with a brain knows that too. I heard the horses first. My horses, the way a herd will shift when something spooks them at the fence. It's a specific sound, different from the restless night shifting. I was awake before I decided to be, and I had my boots and my coat on, and the rifle in my hand in less than a minute. And when I came through the door onto the porch, Doyle was already coming out of the bunkhouse. There were two of them at the corral fence. They'd come in from the creek side, which was smart. The brush there would hide approach, and the sound of the water covers some noise. One of them had wire cutters and had already cut the bottom two strands of the corral fence. The horses were moving in a tight circle inside, nervous, not yet broken. I said in a voice that carries but doesn't shout, "Step back from that fence." The one with the wire cutters turned, and the other one, bigger man, I could see that even at that distance, turned to face me, and I could see he had a pistol already out. That's the moment that matters. What a man does in that moment tells you which kind of man he is. Doyle moved left, which he knew to do. I moved right. The big man was doing the arithmetic of two rifles at different angles. Then the barn door opened. Behind the two men, the barn door swung open and the lamplight came out, and Nora was in that doorway with a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, and behind her Rays was moving to the right to make a third angle. 4 corners. Men do bad mathematics under pressure, but even bad mathematics gets to 4. "This is going to go badly for you," I said to the two men. I was not excited when I said it. I was just telling them the facts as I understood them. There was a long moment. The creek was going somewhere behind the brush. My horses were circling. The big man put the pistol down in the dirt. The one with the wire cutters dropped them. They rode out the way they'd come in, which I watched until I couldn't hear them anymore. I let out a breath then that I hadn't known I'd been holding. Doyle went to check the fence. Rays went back inside with Nora. I stood in the yard for another minute, looking south toward the creek, just making sure. When I came inside, Nora was at the fireplace with the shotgun leaned against the wall. She turned and looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "You were supposed to stay out of the line of it," I said. "I was in the barn," she said. "I was completely behind cover." I looked at her, she looked back. "Thank you," I said. She went to the kitchen and put water on and didn't say anything else about it. And that was right. That is the way to handle something like that. You don't circle it repeatedly. You close it and go on. But I stood there a moment longer after she'd gone to the kitchen, and I was aware of what had just happened, not as a story to tell but as a fact to hold. She had not run. She had not waited to see how it went. She had picked up her shotgun and opened that barn door and become the 4th corner. I went to the kitchen and sat down, and we drank coffee in the middle of the night and talked about other things. We brought the susceptible mares into the barn, 3 of them, the ones furthest along. Nora and I worked that together, which is the kind of work where you know fast whether a person is worth being next to in an enclosed space with a nervous animal. She was good in the small space, calm-handed, knowing when to speak to a horse and when not to. We got all 3 in without incident, which is not guaranteed. By midday we had the stalls bedded and the horses settled, and we stood in the barn doorway looking out at the snow still coming down steady. And I said something about the south fence, about whether it would hold the weight if this went on. She said, "The 3rd post from the creek bend is soft. I noticed it last week." I said, "Why didn't you say something?" She looked at me sidelong. "I was going to." When it mattered," she said. I almost argued with that. I probably should have argued with it. The post needed to be checked regardless of weather. But I looked at her profile in the barn doorway, the snow coming down behind her, and what I felt wasn't irritation. It was something I'd almost forgotten the shape of. The feeling of a capable person alongside you who has noticed the same things you have and is thinking 3 moves ahead. "I'll go check it after the midday feed," I said. "I'll come," she said. We walked the south fence line in the snow, which was above the boot tops by then. The third post from the creek bend was, as she'd said, soft in the ground, the wood punky at the base. I worked it back and forth and it gave 3 inches easily. We went back for tools and came back and I spent an hour in the cold replacing it, and she held the wire and handed tools and didn't complain about the cold, which I noticed, because the cold was serious. When we were done, I looked at the fence and it was right, and I looked at my hands, which were red and stiff, and I thought about what this season would look like if I'd let that post wait. "Thank you," I said. She said, "It's your fence." "For coming out," I said. "You didn't have to." She looked at me with the green eyes steady. "I know I didn't have to," she said. We walked back in the snow and the light was going down early behind the clouds and the stone house had smoke coming from the chimney where Doyle had built the fire up, and it looked, I noticed it as a thing, the way you notice a thing you don't usually let yourself notice. It looked like a home. Not just a structure, a home, with people in it. The blizzard came in January. 3 days of it, which is longer than a blizzard has any business being in this country. The snow came horizontal off the lawn and piled against the north side of the barn until we had to cut a path through it to get to the stock. Temperatures dropped to a place where the water troughs froze solid through the night and had to be broken with an axe every morning. On the second day of it, one of the mares, the bay I'd been most worried about, a first-time mother carrying twins by my best calculation, started showing signs of distress in the early hours. I heard it from the house, something not right in the pitch of the sound that carries through cold air in a particular way, and I was up and dressed and had my coat on before I was fully awake. Nora was already in the barn. I don't know how she knew. She said later she'd been checking every 2 hours through the night, which was not something I had asked her to do and was not something she'd told me about. She was already at the stall, lantern hung on the hook, her coat over her nightclothes, kneeling in the straw. The mare was down and breathing fast. We worked through that night and into the morning. I will not make it dramatic in the telling. The facts of it are dramatic enough on their own. We lost one of the twins, which we'd known was likely. The other one we did not lose, and that took everything we had, both of us in that stall for hours in the cold while the blizzard worked outside and the lantern threw its small orange light. Nora's hands were better than mine in that space, steadier, and I let them be what they were without any feeling about it except gratitude. When it was over and the foal was on its feet and the mare was settled, we sat against the wall of the stall in the straw, both of us done in the way you only get from that particular kind of work, and the foal was making the small, uncertain sounds a new foal makes, and the blizzard was still going outside, but it was just noise now, just weather. I looked at the foal, small and dark, still wet in places, working out what its legs were for. His nose touched the mare's flank and she turned and looked at him, and he looked back with the particular expression newborns have, that expression of enormous and undivided attention toward the first thing they've ever seen. "Good," I said. It was all I had. Nora had her knees up and her arms on her knees and she was watching the foal too. "Yes," she said. We sat there a while longer. The lantern made its small circle of orange, and beyond it the stall was shadow, and the blizzard pressed at the barn walls in a steady, even way like something that is not in a hurry because it knows it has the time. I was aware of a thing that I will try to say correctly. In all the years I had worked this land, the cold seasons and the hard ones, the losses and the slow gains, I had never once had anyone in a moment like this who had worked as hard as I had for the same outcome and cared about it in the same clean way. I had hands, good ones, but hands work for wages and wages change the quality of the caring, not in any dishonorable way, just in the nature of things. This was different. She had not been paid to be in that stall at 3 in the morning in the worst cold of the year. She had come because she was who she was. I had been a long time not having another person in a moment like this. The long work and the cold and the particular quality of surviving something together, there's a texture to that you can't manufacture. I was aware of it in a way I hadn't let myself be aware of anything in years. The awareness was uncomfortable, and I let it be uncomfortable. "I don't do this well," I said. She turned her head and looked at me. "Having someone else here," I said. "I'm not practiced at it." She looked at me steadily. She didn't fill the silence, just let it hold what it was holding. "But I am glad," I said, "that you are here." She was quiet another moment. Then she said, "I know you are." And then, plain as anything, she said, "I am too." That's all that was said. We got up and got back to work. February, the breeding season proper. This is the part of the year that justifies everything else, that pays back the cold and the expense and the work. I had been planning the pairing since fall, adjusting the plan as the season changed, and now with Nora I went through the ledger and the plans together, and what came out of those conversations was better than what I had planned alone. Not dramatically better, just cleaner, tighter, a second set of eyes that had its own knowledge. She noticed things I had learned to look around. Not because I was careless, but because you look around what you know, the way you stop seeing a familiar room. She had not spent 20 years building this particular program, so she saw it fresh, and some of what she saw made me go back to the ledger and mark changes. The change that mattered most was about the Grulla. Her call on the 2-week wait had been right. The left hip had leveled out over November, and by the time she went with the stallion in early February, she moved clean and the pairing went the way you hope pairings go, smooth and without incident. When I wrote it in the ledger, I wrote the date and Nora's initials alongside mine, which I don't think she saw me do, but I did it. I am a man who has been precise about what belongs to him. Land, horses, work, reputation. I have kept very clear accounts. Part of that precision is knowing when something belongs to someone else and not appropriating it. The Grulla was my horse and the call had been Nora's. The ledger should reflect that. The foal that would come from that pairing, months away still, in the calculation of things, I already knew would be one of the best horses this place would produce. I didn't say that out loud in February, but I knew it. I am describing this as if it was business. It was, but it was also something else, and I'm not a man who usually tries to find words for the something else, so I'll try and allow for the fact that the words are going to be rougher than the thing. She had come to this place in a particular way, not because she had sought it, not because she had a design on it, but because she had seen a man's horses in a box canyon and done what the kind of person she is does when they see that. She had done it without calculation and without any notion of what came after. And what came after was this: these months of cold work, these conversations over supper, the blizzard, the stall, the foal. The particular gravity that builds between two people who are working toward the same thing and are honest with each other about the work. I had not planned any of it, but I had also not, at any point, regretted it. And for a man who has spent 30 years guarding what he builds, that is not a small thing. I told her one evening in February, we were in the barn, going through the schedule for the next week, the lantern between us on the workbench. I told her that the spring contracts were going to be stronger than they'd been in 3 years. Because of the foals that were coming, yes, but also because of how the breeding season had gone. Because of the decisions we'd made together. It would have been a good season anyway, she said. It's a better one, I said. She looked at the schedule and didn't say anything. Nora, I said. She looked up. I had thought about how to say this. I am not a man who does not think about how to say something. I had thought about it several times and found that the straightforward version was the only one that didn't embarrass me. The arrangement was supposed to end in the spring, I said. You go back to the Llano. I know that's what we said. Yes, she said. I'm asking you not to, I said. She was very still. The Vess place is yours, I said. That doesn't change. Ray's has done good work here, and if he wants to stay, there's a place for him. If you want to bring the horses up here permanent, we can work out what that looks like. If you want to keep running the Vess place and come and go, we can work that out too. I paused. What I'm asking is that you don't leave." She was looking at me the way she sometimes looked, not as if she was deciding what to think, but as if she was deciding what to say about what she already thought. "Why?" she said, not challenging, just wanting the thing said. "Because this is better with you in it," I said. "What I've built here, it's better." She was quiet for a long moment, the lantern between us on the bench. A horse shifted in a stall somewhere behind us. "I know what you're not saying," she said finally. "I'm saying it," I said. "It's not coming out right, but I'm saying it." She looked at me for another moment, and then she did something she hadn't done in all these months, something that surprised me entirely. She reached across the workbench and put her hand over mine, not soft, just there, solid and sure. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." I didn't say anything. I turned my hand over and held hers, and the lantern burned between us, and outside the horses moved quietly in the dark, and that was the whole of it. What I want you to understand, because I've thought about what this story is and what it isn't, is that this was not a story about rescue. She did not need rescuing. She had run her father's place through 3 hard seasons alone, and she had gone into the breaks country and recovered 8 horses from 3 men. And whatever happened in that canyon, I do not ask about, because I know the kind of woman who does that kind of thing, and she is not the kind of woman who requires rescue. This was a story about 2 people who had spent a long time building things alone and found, late and somewhat surprised, that the building went better with the other one present. I have been told before, not often, but it has been said that I am not an easy man to be around, that I hold things close and am slow to give ground, and that the walls I've built in this canyon are not all made of stone. I do not dispute any of that. It is an accurate accounting. What I will tell you is that Nora Vess looked at those walls and did not seem particularly troubled by them. She did not make a project of bringing them down. She just worked beside me, day after day, and the walls that needed to come down did, in time, in their own way, because the person next to you is not a threat. I want to tell you the truth about what I felt in the barn that February night, after she put her hand over mine and said she'd stay. Because the honest version is more useful than the version I might clean up for telling. What I felt was something very close to fear. Not of her, not of what she was or what she'd asked or any of that. Fear of what it would mean to let this be real. Because I have been, as I said, a man who builds things and guards them, and I had spent 30 years not allowing myself to need what I could not guarantee. You cannot guarantee a person. You cannot write it in a ledger and run the fence and know it will hold. A person makes their own choices every day, and one of those choices might be to go, and if you have let yourself depend on them, the going takes something you will not get back. I had not let anything take something I would not get back, not in 30 years. But I let her hand stay over mine, and I turned my hand over and held hers, and I made the calculation that I had been making since October without knowing I was making it, that some things are worth the risk of loss, or they are nothing. That a man who has built good things and is too afraid to let a good woman share them has not, in the end, built anything worth sharing. She is not a soft woman. I have said that, and I'll say it again because I think it matters to why I trusted her with this. She does not flatter, and she does not require flattery. She will tell you when you're wrong, and she will let you tell her when she's wrong, and neither one of those exchanges takes anything from either person. That's a rare quality. In a person of any description, it's rare. She had also, in a box canyon somewhere in the breaks, in circumstances I never asked about, recovered 8 horses that were not hers and brought them 12 miles through the dark. Whatever else you want to say about Nora Vess, say that first. The spring came and the foals came and the contracts were fulfilled, and then some. The Grulla mare had a filly that I will tell you, between us, is the best horse I have put on this ground in 15 years. Nora knew it before I said it, watched that filly in the pasture with the same quiet attention she'd brought to everything. The Vess horses stayed. Ray stayed. The bunkhouse is full in a way it hasn't been since the early years, and the work is, I won't say easy, because this land doesn't offer easy, but it is right. The kind of right that comes from something organized correctly, each part doing its proper work. I have thought some about my father lately. He was a Texas man, died when I was 17, not much of a rancher but an honest one. He used to say that you could tell a man's character by what he put his name to. He meant land and contracts and handshakes, but I think it goes further than that. I think you can tell a man's character by what he allows himself to value. A man who values only what he can lock up and account for is a man whose life will be very precisely measured and very thin. I did not want a thin life. I had built that canyon up for 30 years, and I did not want to stand in it alone in the end, in a stone house full of ledgers, with nothing but the accuracy of my own accounts to stand witness. In May, I rode down to Turling to file some papers at the county clerk's office, which is not a thing I enjoy. The clerk is a man named Briggs who talks too much and knows it. He looked at my papers and looked at me and said, "Here you've got the Vess woman up at the Rojo." "I do," I said. "Smart woman," he said. "Her father was decent, she's better." "Yes," I said. He looked at me over his glasses the way Briggs looks at people. "Must be nice," he said, "having someone like that." I thought about that word having and whether it was right, and decided it wasn't exactly. She was not something I had. She was someone who had chosen to be here, on her own terms, with her own horses and her own hand and her own clear view of things. That she had chosen to be here, that a woman of that quality, with that eye and that nerve and that plain-spoken honesty, had looked at this place and at me and said, "All right, I'll stay," that was not a possession. That was a gift, and I knew the difference. "Yes," I said to Briggs, "it is." I rode home in the late May light. The canyon country opening up around me the way it does when you know it long enough that it starts to feel like a language you're fluent in. The stone house was on the ridge and smoke was coming from the kitchen, which meant supper was started, and in the west pasture I could see the horses moving slow in the late light, mine and hers together, the whole herd, and below the barn the Grulla's filly was running the fence line for the pleasure of it, because she was young and the evening was cool and she had the room. I sat my horse on the ridge for a minute and just looked. You build a thing over 30 years, and you don't always look at it. You're in it working it, fixing what breaks and planning what's next. The looking is something you don't have time for, or you don't let yourself have time for, one or the other. I had been inside this place for so long I had forgotten what it looked like from a ridge. It looked like something. I'll say that plainly. The stone house and the good fence and the horses in the evening light and the smoke from the kitchen. It looked like the thing a man sets out to build when he is young and convinced and has $40 and a Sharps rifle and nothing else. It looked like that thing realized, completed, breathing. And what made it that? What made it the finished thing it was instead of just the accumulation of work, was the smoke. Knowing who had made that smoke. Knowing she was down there, and that she had chosen to be, and that she would still be there when I rode off this ridge. I rode down off the ridge into the evening. My horse picked its way on the familiar path, choosing each step, and the canyon opened around us, and the last light was going red along the rim, and I could hear the horses in the pasture and the sound of the creek somewhere in the brush. The stars were coming in ahead of the dark, faint first and then stronger. I came down into the yard and dismounted and tied the horse at the rail and stood there a moment in the cooling air. The brown horse, Nora's brown horse, was at the other rail, and she flicked an ear at me, and I went over and ran a hand along her neck, and she accepted it the way a good horse accepts something certain and known. I went up the porch steps and I could smell the supper through the door, something with onions and the smoke of the fireplace, and I stood on that porch for one more second, and I thought about the gate chain, warm in October, and the 9 sets of hoofprints, and the woman who had come back at first light on that brown horse and said your horses are in your corral, as if it were a simple thing, as if she had not spent 3 days and however many nights making it so. I opened the door of the stone house I had built with my own hands, and I went in, and the warmth and the light came up around me, and I was home.